This is A Honeymoon in Space by George Chetwynd Griffith, a work in the public domain. Chapter 7. Well, madame, we've arrived. This is the moon, and there is the Earth. To put it into plain figures, you are now 240,000 odd miles away from home. I think you said you would like breakfast on the surface of the world that has been, and so, as it's about 11 o'clock Earth time, we'll call it a déjeuner, and then we'll go and see what this poor old skeleton of a world is like. Oh, then we shan't actually have breakfast on the moon. My dear child, of course you will. Isn't the Astronef resting now? Right now, as they say in some parts of the States, on the top of the crater wall of Tycho. Aren't we really and actually on the surface of the moon? Just look at this frightful black and white God-forsaken landscape. Isn't it like everything that you've ever learnt about the moon? Nothing but light and shade, black and white, peaks of mountains blazing in sunlight, and valleys underneath them as black as the hinges of— "Toffet," said Zaidie, interrupting him quickly. "Yes, I see what you mean. So we'll have our déjeuner here, breathing our own nice atmosphere, and eating and drinking what was grown on the soil of dear old Mother Earth. It's a wee bit paralysing to think of, isn't it, dear? 240,000 miles across the gulf of space, and we sitting here at our breakfast table just as comfortable as though we were in the Cecil in London or the Waldorf Astoria in New York. There's nothing much in that, I mean as regards distance. You see, before we've finished, we shall probably, at least I hope we shall, be eating a breakfast or a dinner together 1,000 million miles or more from New York or London. Your ladyship must remember that this is only the first stage on the journey, the jumping-off place as you called it. You see, the distance from Washington to New York is, well, it isn't even a hop, skip and a jump in comparison with— Oh yes, I see what you mean, of course. And so I suppose I had better cut off or short-circuit such sympathies with Mother Earth as are not connected with your noble self, and get breakfast ready. How's that? Well, said Lord Redgrave, looking at her as she rose from the table, I think our honeymoon in space is young enough yet to make it possible for me to say that your ladyship's opinion is exactly right. That's a hopeless commonplace. Really, Lennox, I thought you were capable of something better than that. My dear Zaidie, it has been my fate to have many friends who have had honeymoons on Earth, and some of their experience seems to be that the man who contradicts his wife during the first 6 weeks of matrimony simply makes an ass of himself. He offends her and makes himself unhappy, and it sometimes takes 6 months or more to get back to bearings. What a lot of silly men and women you must have known, Lennox. Is that the way Englishmen start marriage in England? If it is, I don't wonder at Englishmen coming across the Atlantic in liners and airships and so on to get American wives. I guess you can't understand your own womenfolk. Or perhaps they don't understand us. But anyhow, I don't think I've made any great mistake. No, I don't think you have. Of course, if I thought so, I wouldn't be here now. But this is very well for a breakfast talk, all the same. I should like to know how we are going to take the promenade you promised me on the surface of the moon. Your ladyship has only to finish her breakfast, and then everything shall be made plain to her, even the deepest craters of the mountains of the moon. Very well then, I will eat swiftly and in obedience, and meanwhile, as your lordship seems to have finished, perhaps— Yes, I will go and see to the mechanical necessities, said Redgrave, swallowing his last cup of coffee and getting up. If you'll come down to the lower deck when you've finished, I'll have your breathing suit ready for you, and then we'll go into the air chamber. Thanks, dear, yes, she said, putting out her hand to him as he left the table. The antechamber to other worlds. Isn't it just lovely? Fancy me being able to leave one world and land on another, and have you to say just those few words which make it all possible. I wonder what all the girls of all the civilized countries of Earth would give just to be me right now. They could none of them give what you gave me, Zaidie, because you see from my point of view there's only one Zaidie in the world, or as perhaps I ought to say just now, in the solar system. Very prettily said, sir, she laughed, when she had given him his due reward for his courtly speech. I am too dazed with all these wonders about me to reply to it? You've given me the most convincing reply possible. Now finish your breakfast, and I'll tell you when the breathing dresses and the air chamber are ready. By the way, don't forget your cameras. It's quite possible we may find something worth taking pictures of, and you needn't trouble much about the weight. You know, you and I and all that we carry will only weigh about 1/6 of what we did on the Earth. Very well then, I'll take the whole plate apparatus as well as the Kodak and the panorama camera. When I'm ready, Murgatroyd will tell you to come down. But isn't he coming with us too? My dear girl, if I were to ask Murgatroyd to leave the Astronef, there'd be a mutiny on board. A mutiny of 1 against 1. No, he's left his native world, but he says he's done it in a ship that's made with British steel out of English iron mines, smelted, forged and fashioned in English works. And so to him it's a bit of England, however far away from Mother Earth it may be. And if you ever see Andrew Murgatroyd's big head and good ungainly body outside the Astronef in any of the worlds, dead or alive, that we're going to visit, well, when we get back to Mother Earth you may ask me, I don't think I'll have to ask you for anything, Lennox. I believe if I wanted anything you'd know before I did, so go away and get those breathing dresses ready. I didn't come to the moon to talk commonplaces with a husband I've been married to for nearly 3 days. Is it really as long as that? Oh, don't be ridiculous, even if you are beyond the limits of earthly conventionalities. Anyhow, I've been married long enough to want my own way, and just now I want a promenade on the moon. The will of her ladyship is a law unto her servant, and that which she hath said shall be done. If you come down onto the lower deck in 10 minutes, everything shall be ready. With this he disappeared down the companion way. About 5 minutes afterwards, Andrew Murgatroyd showed his grizzled, long-bearded face with its high forehead, heavy brows and broad-set eyes, long nose and shaven upper lip, just above the stairway, and said, for all the world as though he might have been giving out the number of the hymn in his beloved Ebenezer at Smeaton, "If it pleases your ladyship, his lordship is ready, and if you'll please come down I'll show you the way." "Oh, thank you, Mr. Murgatroyd," said Zaidie, getting up and going towards the companion. "Way, but I'm afraid you don't think that. I mean, you don't seem to take very much interest." "If your ladyship will pardon me," said the old man, standing aside to let her go down, "it is not my business to think on board his lordship's vessel. I am his servant, and my fathers have been his father's servants for more years than I'd like to count. If it wasn't that way, I wouldn't be here. Will your ladyship please to come down?" Zaidie bowed her beautiful head in recognition of this age's old devotion, and said as she passed him, more sweetly than he had ever heard human lips speak, "Thank you, Mr. Murgatroyd. You've taught me something in those few words that we have no knowledge of in the States. Good service is as honourable as good mastership. Thank you." Murgatroyd put up his lower lip and half smiled with his upper, for he was not yet quite sure of this radiant beauty, who, according to his ideas, should have been English and wasn't. Then, with a rather clumsy and yet eloquent gesture, he showed her the way down to the air-chamber. She nodded to him with a smile as she passed in through the tight door, and when she heard the levers swing to and the bolts shoot into their places, she felt as though, for the time being, she had said goodbye to a friend. Her husband was waiting for her almost fully clad in his breathing dress. He had hers all ready to put on, and when the necessary changes and investments had been made, Zaidie found herself clad in a costume which was not by any means unlike the diving dresses of common use, save that they were very much lighter in construction. The helmets were smaller, and not having to withstand outside pressure, they were made of welded aluminum, lined thickly with asbestos, not to keep the cold out, but the heat in. On the back of the dress there was a square case, looking like a knapsack, containing the expanding apparatus, which would furnish breathable air for an almost unlimited time. As long as the liquefied air from a cylinder hung below, it passed through the cells in which the breathed air had been deprived of its carbonic acid gas and other noxious ingredients. The pressure of air inside the helmet automatically regulated the supply, which was not permitted to circulate through the other portions of the dress. The reasons for this precaution were very simple. Granted the absence of atmosphere on the moon, any air in the dress, which was woven of a cunning compound of silk and asbestos, would instantly expand with irresistible force, burst the covering, and expose the limbs of the explorers to a cold which would be infinitely more destructive than the hottest of earthly fires. It would wither them to nothing in a moment, a human hand or foot. We won't say anything about faces, exposed to the summer or winter temperature of the moon, that is to say, to its sunlight and its darkness, would be shriveled into dry bone in a moment, and therefore Lord Redgrave, foreseeing this, had provided the breathing dresses. Lastly, the two helmets were connected, for purposes of conversation, by a light wire, the two ends of which were connected with a little telephonic receiver and transmitter inside each of the headdresses. "Well, now I think we're ready," said Redgrave, putting his hand on the lever which opened the outer door. His voice sounded a little queer and squeaky over the wire, and, for the matter of that, so did Zaidie's as she replied, "Yes, I'm ready, I think. I hope these things will work all right. You may be quite sure that I shouldn't have put you into one of them if I hadn't tested them pretty thoroughly," he replied, swinging the door open and throwing out a light folding iron ladder which was hinged to the floor. They were in the shade cast by the hull of the Astronef. For about 10 yards in front of her, Zadie saw a dense black shadow, and beyond it a stretch of grey-white sand lit up by a glare of sunlight, which would have been intolerable if it had not been for the smoke-coloured slicks of glass which had been fitted behind the glass visors of the helmets. Over it were thickly scattered boulders and pieces of rock bleached and desiccated, and each throwing a black shadow, fantastically shaped and yet clearly defined on the grey-white sand behind it. There was no soil, and all the softer kind of rock and stone had crumbled away ages ago. Every particle of moisture had long since evaporated. Even chemical combinations had been dissolved by the alternations of heat and cold known only on Earth to the chemist in his laboratory. Only the hardest rocks, such as granites and basalts, remained. Everything else had been reduced to the universal grey-white impalpable powder into which Zadie's shoes sank when she, holding her husband's hand, went down the ladder and stood at the foot of it, first of the Earth dwellers to set foot on another world. Redgrave followed her with a little spring from the centre of the ladder, which landed him with strange gentleness beside her. He took both her gloved hands and pressed them hard in his. He would have kissed his welcome to the world that had been if he could, but that of course was out of the question, and so he had to be content with telling her that he wanted to. Then, hand in hand, they crossed the little plateau towards the edge of the tremendous gulf, 54 miles across and nearly 20,000 feet deep, which forms the crater of Tycho. In the middle of it rose a conical mountain about 5,000 feet high, the summit of which was just beginning to catch the solar rays. Half of the vast plain was already brilliantly illuminated, but round the central cone was a semicircle of shadow of impenetrable blackness. Day and night in this same valley, actually side by side, said Zadie. Then she stopped and pointed down into the brightly lit distance and went on hurriedly. Look, Lennox, look at the foot of the mountain there. Doesn't that seem like the ruins of a city? It does, he said, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be. I've always thought that, as the air and water disappeared from the upper parts of the moon, the inhabitants, whoever they were, must have been driven down into the deeper parts. Shall we go down and see? But how? She said. He pointed towards the Astronef. She nodded her helmeted head, and they went back towards the vessel. A few minutes later, the space navigator had risen from her resting place with an impetus which rapidly carried her over half of the vast crater, and then she began to drop slowly into the depths. She grounded gently, and presently they were standing on the ground about a mile from the central cone. This time, however, Redgrave had taken the precaution to bring a magazine rifle and a couple of revolvers with him in case any strange monsters, relics of the vanished fauna of the moon, might still be taking refuge in these mysterious depths. Zadie, although like a good many American girls she could shoot excellently well, carried no weapon more offensive than the photographic apparatus aforesaid. The first thing that Redgrave did when they stepped out onto the sandy surface of the plain was to stoop down and strike a wax match. There was a tiny glimmer of light which was immediately extinguished. No air here, he said, so we shall find no living beings, at any rate none like ourselves. They found the walking exceedingly easy, although their boots were purposely weighted in order to counteract, to some extent, the great difference in gravity. A few minutes brought them to the outskirts of the city. It had no walls and exhibited no signs of any devices for defence. Its streets were broad and well paved, and the houses, built of great blocks of grey stone joined together with white cement, looked as fresh and unworn as though they had only been built a few months, whereas they had probably stood for hundreds of thousands of years. They were flat-roofed, all of one story, and practically of one type. There were very few public buildings, and absolutely no attempt at ornamentation was visible. Round some of the houses were spaces which might once have been gardens. In the midst of the city, which appeared to cover an area of about 4 square miles, was an enormous square paved with flagstones, which were covered to the depth of a couple of inches with a light grey dust, which, as they walked across it, remained perfectly still, save for the disturbance caused by their footsteps. There was no air to support it, otherwise it might have risen in clouds about them. From the centre of this square rose a huge pyramid nearly 1,000 feet in height, the sole building of the great silent city, which appeared to have been raised most probably as a temple by the hands of its long-dead inhabitants. When they got nearer, they saw a white fringe round the steps by which it was approached, and they soon found that this fringe was composed of millions of white bleached bones and skulls, shaped very much like those of terrestrial men, save that they were very much larger, and that the ribs were out of all proportion to the rest of the skeleton. They stopped stricken before this strange spectacle. Redgrave stooped down and took hold of one of the bones, a huge femur. It broke in two as he tried to lift it, and the piece which remained in his hand crumbled instantly to white powder. Whoever they were, he said, they were giants. When air and water failed above, they came down here by some means and built this city. You see what enormous chests they must have had. That would be nature's last struggle to enable them to breathe the diminishing atmosphere. These, of course, were the last descendants of the fittest to breathe it. This was their temple, I suppose, and here they came to die. I wonder how many thousand years ago. Perishing of heat and cold and hunger and thirst, the last tragedy of a race, which, after all, must have been something like ourselves. It's just too awful for words, said Zadie. Shall we go into the temple? That seems one of the entrances up there, only I don't like walking over all those bones. I don't suppose they'll mind if we do, replied Redgrave, only we mustn't go far in. It may be full of cross passages and mazes, and we might never get out. Our lamps won't be much use in there, you know, for there's no air. They'll just be points of light, and we shan't see anything but them. It's very aggravating, but I'm afraid there's no help for it. Come along. They ascended the steps, crushing the bones and skulls to powder beneath their feet, and entered the huge square doorway, which looked like a rectangle of blackness against the grey-white of the wall. Even through their asbestos-woven clothing, they felt a sudden shock of icy cold. In those few steps they had passed from a temperature of tenfold summer heat into one below that of the coldest spots on earth. They turned on the electric lamps which were fitted to the breastplates of their dresses, but they could see nothing save the thin thread of light straight in front of them. It did not even spread. It was like a polished needle on a background of black velvet. All about them was darkness impenetrable, and so they reluctantly turned back to the doorway, leaving all the mysteries which that vast temple of a long-vanished people might contain to remain mysteries to the end of time. They passed down the steps again and crossed the square, and for the next half-hour Sadie was busy taking photographs of the pyramid with its ghastly surroundings, and a few general views of this strange city of the dead. Chapter 8. When they got back, they found Murgatroyd pacing up and down the floor of the deck chamber, looking about him with serious eyes, but betraying no other visible sign of anxiety. The Astronef was at once his home and his idol, and, as Redgrave had said, even his own direct orders would hardly have induced him to leave her, even in a world in which there was not a living human being to dispute possession of her. When they had resumed their ordinary clothing, the Astronef rose from the surface of the plain, crossed the encircling wall at the height of a few hundred feet, and made her way at a speed of about 50 miles an hour towards the regions of the South Pole. Behind them to the northwest, they could see from their elevation of nearly 30,000 feet the vast expanse of the Sea of Clouds. Dotted here and there were the shining points and ridges of light marking the peaks and crater walls which the rays of the rising sun had already touched. Before them and to the right and left rose a vast maze of ragged, splintery peaks and huge ramparts of mountain walls enclosing plains so far below their summits that the light of neither sun nor earth ever reached them. By directing the force exerted by what might now be called the propelling part of the engines against the mountain masses, which they crossed to right and left and behind, Redgrave was able to take a zigzag course that carried them over many of the walled plains which were wholly or partially lit up by the sun. And in nearly all of the deepest, their telescopes revealed something like what they had found within the crater of Tycho. At length, pointing to a gigantic circle of white light fringing an abyss of utter darkness, he said, "There is Newton, the greatest mystery of the moon. Those inner walls are 24,000 feet high. That means that the bottom, which has never been seen by human eyes, is about 5,000 feet below the surface of the moon. What do you say, dear? Shall we go down and see if the searchlight will show us anything? You know there may be something like breathable air down there, and perhaps living creatures who can breathe it." "Certainly," replied Zadie decisively. "Haven't we come to see things that nobody else has ever seen?" Redgrave went down to the engine room, and presently the Astronef changed her course, and in a few minutes was hanging with her polished hull bathed in sunlight, like a star suspended over the unfathomable gulf of darkness below. As they sank below the level of the sun rays, Murgatroyd turned on both the searchlights. They dropped down ever slowly, and more slowly, until gradually, the two long, thin streams of light began to spread themselves out. The lower they went, the more the beams spread out, and by the time the Astronef came gently to a rest, they were swinging round her in broad fans of diffused light over a dark, marshy surface with scattered patches of grey moss and reeds. with dull gleams of stagnant water showing between them. Air and water at last. I thought so, said Redgrave, as he rejoined her on the upper deck. Air and water and eternal darkness. Well, we shall find life on the moon here if anywhere. I suppose we had better put on our breathing dresses, hadn't we? Asked Zadie. Certainly, he replied, because, although there is some sort of air, we don't know yet whether we shall be able to breathe it. It may be half carbon dioxide for all we know, but a few matches will soon tell us that. Within a quarter of an hour, they were again standing on the surface. Murgatroyd had orders to follow them as far as possible with the head searchlight, which, in the comparatively rarefied atmosphere, appeared to have a range of several miles. Redgrave struck a match and held it up level with his head. It burnt with a clear, steady yellow flame. "Where a match will burn a man should be able to breathe," he said. "I'm going to see what lunar air is like." "For heaven's sake be careful, dear," came the reply in pleading tones across the wire. "All right, but don't open your helmet till I tell you." He then raised the hermetically closed slide of glass, which formed the front of the helmets, half an inch or so. Instantly he felt a sensation like the drawing of a red-hot iron across his skin. He snapped the visor down and clasped it in its place. For a moment or two he gasped for breath, and then he said rather faintly, "It's no good, it's too cold. It would freeze the blood of a salamander. I think we'd better go back and explore this place under cover. We can't do anything in the dark, and we can see just as well from the upper deck with the searchlights. Besides, as there's air and water here, there's no telling but there may be inhabitants of sorts, such as we shouldn't care to meet." He took her hand, and to Murgatroyd's great relief, they went back to the vessel. Redgrave then raised the Astronef a couple of 100 feet and, by directing the repulsive force against the mountain walls, developed just sufficient energy to keep them moving at about 12 miles an hour. They began to cross the plain with their searchlights flashing out in all directions. They had scarcely gone a mile before the headlight fell upon a moving form, half walking, half crawling among some stunted brown-leaved bushes by the side of a broad, stagnant stream. "Look," said Zadie, clasping his arm. "Is that a gorilla? Or, no, it can't be a man." A light was turned full upon the object. If it had been covered with hair, it might have passed for some strange type of the ape tribe, but its skin was smooth and of a livid grey. Its lower limbs were evidently more powerful than its upper. Its chest was enormously developed, but the stomach was small. The head was big and round and smooth. As they came nearer, they saw that in place of fingernails, it had long white feelers, which it kept extended and constantly waving about as it groped its way towards the water. As the intense light flashed full on it, it turned its head towards them. It had a nose and a mouth. The nose, long and thick, with huge mobile nostrils, the mouth forming an angle something like a fish's lips. Teeth there seemed none. At either side of the upper part of the nose there were 2 little sunken holes, in which this thing's ancestors of countless thousands of years ago had once had eyes. As she looked upon this awful parody of what had once perhaps been a human face, Zadie covered hers with her hands and uttered a little moan of horror. "Horrible, isn't it?" said Redgrave. "I suppose that's what the last remnants of the Lunarians have come to. Evidently once men and women, something like ourselves. I dare say the ancestors of that thing have lived here in coldness and darkness for hundreds of generations. It shows how tremendously tenacious nature is of life. Ages ago, no doubt, that brute's ancestors lived up yonder when there were seas and rivers, fields and forests, just as we have them on earth, among men and women who could see and breathe and enjoy everything in life, and had built up civilizations like ours. Look, it's going to fish or something. Now we shall see what it feeds on. I wonder why the water isn't frozen. I suppose there must be some internal heat left still. A few patches with lakes of lava under them. Perhaps this valley is just over one, and that's why these creatures have managed to survive. Ah, there's another of them, smaller, not so strongly formed. That thing's mate, I suppose, female of the species. Ah, I wonder how many hundred of thousands of years it will take for our descendants to come to that. I hope our dear old Earth will hit something else and be smashed to atoms before that happens," exclaimed Zadie, whose curiosity had now partly overcome her horror. "Look, it's trying to catch something." The larger of the 2 creatures had groped its way to the edge of the sluggish, oily water and dropped, or rather rolled, quietly into it. It was evidently cold-blooded, or nearly so, for no warm-blooded animal would have taken to such water so naturally. Presently the other dropped in too, and both disappeared for some moments. Then, in the midst of a violent commotion in the water a few yards away, they rose to the surface of the water, the larger with a wriggling eel-like fish between its jaws. They both groped their way towards the edge and had just reached it and were pulling themselves out when a hideous shape rose out of the water behind them. It was like the head of an octopus joined to the body of a boa constrictor, but head and neck were both of the same ghastly livid grey as the other two creatures. It was evidently blind too, for it took no notice of the brilliant glare of the searchlight, but it moved rapidly towards the two scrambling forms, its long white feelers trembling out in all directions. Then one of them touched the smaller of the two shapes. Instantly, the rest shot out and closed round it, and with scarcely a struggle it was dragged beneath the water and vanished. Zadie uttered a little low scream and covered her face again, and Redgrave said, "The same old brutal law, you see, life preying upon life even on a dying world, a world that is more than half dead itself. Well, I think we've seen enough of this place. I suppose those are about the only types of life we should meet anywhere, and I don't want to know much more about them. I vote we go and see what the invisible hemisphere is like." "I have had all I want of this side," said Zadie, looking away from the scene of the hideous tragedy, "so the sooner we go, the better I shall like it." A few minutes later, the Astronef was again rising towards the stars with her searchlights still flashing down into the valley of expiring life, which had seemed to them even worse than the valley of death. As he followed the rays with a pair of powerful field glasses, Redgrave fancied that he saw huge, dim shapes moving about the stunted shrubbery and through the slimy pools of the stagnant rivers, and once or twice he got a glimpse of what might well have been the ruins of towns and cities. But the gloom soon became too deep and dense for the searchlights to pierce, and he was glad when the Astronef soared up into the brilliant sunlight once more. Even the ghastly wilderness of the lunar landscape was welcome after the nameless horrors of that hideous abyss. After a couple of hours' rapid travelling, Redgrave pointed down to a comparatively small, deep crater and said, "There, that is Malapert. It is almost exactly at the south pole of the moon, and there," he went on, pointing ahead, "is the horizon of the hemisphere which no earthborn eyes have ever seen." "Except ours," said Zadie somewhat inconsequently, "and I wonder what we shall see." "Probably something very like what we have seen on this side," replied Redgrave, and as the event proved, he was right. Contrary to many ingenious speculations which have been indulged in by both scientist and romancer, they found that the hemisphere, which for countless ages had never been turned towards the earth, was almost an exact replica of the visible one. Fully 3/4 of it was brilliantly illuminated by the sun, and what they saw through their glasses was practically the same as what they had beheld on the earthward side: huge groups of enormous craters and ringed mountains, long, irregular chains crowned with sharp, splintery peaks, and between these vast, deeply depressed areas, ranging in colour from dazzling white to grey-brown, marking the beds of the vanished lunar seas. As they crossed one of these, Redgrave allowed the Astronef to sink to within a few thousand feet of the surface, and then he and Zadie swept it with their telescopes. Their chance search was rewarded by something they had not seen in the seabeds of the other hemisphere. These depressions were far deeper than the others, evidently many thousands of feet below the average surface, but the sun's rays were blazing full into this one, and, dotted round its slopes at varying elevations, they made out little patches which seemed to differ from the general surface. "I wonder if those are the remains of cities," said Zadie. "Isn't it possible that the old peoples of the moon might have built their cities along the seas just as we do, and that their descendants may have followed the waters as they retreated, I mean as they either dried up or disappeared into the centre?" "Very probable indeed, dearest of philosophers," he said, picking her up with one arm and kissing the smiling lips which had just uttered this most reasonable deduction. "Now we'll go down and see." He diminished the vertically repulsive force a little, and the Astronef dropped slantingly towards the bed of what might once have been the Pacific of the moon. When they were within about a couple of thousand feet of the surface, it became perfectly plain that Zadie was correct in her hypothesis. The vast sea floor was thickly strewn with the ruins of countless cities and towns, which had been inhabited by an equally countless series of generations of men and women, who had perhaps lived and loved in the days when our own world was a glowing mass of molten rock, surrounded by the envelope of vapours which has since condensed to form our oceans. They dropped still lower and ran diagonally across the ocean. Bed, and as they did so, Zadie's proposition was more and more completely confirmed, for they saw that the towns and cities which stood highest were the most dilapidated, and that the buildings had evidently been torn and crumbled away by the action of wind and water, snow and ice. The nearer they approached the central and deepest depression, the better preserved and the simpler the buildings became. until down in the lowest depths they found a collection of low-built square edifices, scarcely better than huts, which had clustered round the little lake into which, ages before, the ocean had dwindled. But where the lake had been, there was now only a shallow depression covered with grey sand and brown rock. Into this they descended and touched the lunar surface for the last time. A couple of hours' excursion among the houses proved that they had been the last refuge of the last descendants of a dying race, a race which had socially degenerated just as the succession of cities had done architecturally, age by age, as the long-drawn struggle for mere existence had become keener and keener until the two last essentials, air and water, had failed. And then the end had come. The streets, like the square of the great temple of Tycho, were strewn with myriads and myriads of bones, and there were myriads more scattered round what had once been the shores of the dwindling lake. Here, as elsewhere, there was not a sign or a record of any kind, carving or sculpture. If there were any such on the surface of the moon, they had not discovered them. The buildings which they had seen evidently belonged to the decadent period during which the dwindling remnants of the Selenites asked only to eat and drink and breathe. Inside the great pyramid of the city of Tycho, they might perhaps have found something. Some stone or tablet which bore the mark of the artist's hand. Elsewhere, perhaps, they might have found cities reared by older races, which might have rivaled the creations of Egypt and Babylon. But they had neither time nor inclination to look for these. All that they had seen of the dead world had only sickened and saddened them. The untravelled regions of space peopled by living worlds more akin to their own were before them. The red disk of Mars was glowing in the zenith among the diamond-white clusters which gemmed the black sky behind him. More than 100 millions of miles had to be traversed before they would be able to set foot on his surface, and so, after one last look round the valley of death about them, Redgrave turned on the full energy of the repulsive force in a vertical direction, and the Astronef leapt upwards in a straight line for her new destination. The unknown hemisphere spread out in a vast plain beneath them. The blazing sun rose on their left, and the brilliant silver orb of the earth on their right. And so, full of wonder, and yet without regret, they bade farewell to the world that had been. Chapter 9. The Earth and the Moon had been left more than 100 million miles behind in the depths of space, and the Astronef had crossed this immense gap in 11 days and a few hours. But this apparently inconceivable speed was not altogether due to the powers of the space navigator, for her commander had taken advantage of the passage of the planet along its orbit towards that of the Earth. Hence, while the Astronef was approaching Mars with ever-increasing speed, Mars was travelling towards the Astronef at the rate of 16 miles a second. The great silver disk of the Earth had diminished until it looked only a little larger than Venus appears to human eyes. In fact, the planet Terra is to the inhabitants of Mars what Venus is to us, the star of the morning and the evening. Breakfast on the morning of the 12th day, or, since there is neither day nor night in space, it would be more correct to say the 12th period of 24 Earth hours as measured by the chronometers, was just over, and Redgrave was standing with Zadie in the forward end of the deck chamber, looking downwards at a vast crescent of rosy light, which stretched out over an arc of more than 90 degrees. Two tiny black spots were travelling towards each other across it. "Ah," she said, going towards one of the telescopes, "there are the moons. I was reading my Gulliver last night. I wonder what the old Dean would have given to be here, and see how true his guess was. Are we going to land on them?" "I don't see why we shouldn't," he said. "I think we might find them convenient stopping places. Besides, you know this isn't only a pleasure trip. We have to add as much as we can to the sum of human knowledge, and so of course we shall have to find out whether the moons of Mars have atmospheres and inhabitants." "What, people living on those wee things?" she laughed. "Why, they're only about 30 or 40 miles round, aren't they?" "About," he said. "But then that's just one of the points I want to solve, and as for life, it doesn't always mean people, you know. We are only a few hundred miles away from Deimos, the outer one, and he is 12,500 miles from Mars. I vote we drop on him first and let him carry us towards Phobos. And then when we've examined him, we'll pay a visit to his brother and take a trip round Mars on him. Phobos does the journey in about 7 hours and a half, and as he's only 3,700 miles above the surface, we ought to get a very good view of our next stopping place." "That ought to be quite delightful," said Zadie. "But how commonplace you are getting, Lennox. That's so like you Englishmen. We are doing what has only been dreamt of before, and here you are talking about moons and planets as if they were railway stations." Well, if your ladyship prefers it, we will call them undiscovered islands and continents in the ocean of space. That does sound a little bit better, doesn't it? Now I think I had better go down and see to my engines. When he had gone, Zadie sat down to the telescope again and kept it focused on one of the little black spots travelling across the crescent of Mars. Both it and the other spot rapidly grew larger, and the features of the planet itself became more distinct. Soon, even with her unaided eyes, she could make out the seas and continents and the mysterious canals quite plainly through the clear, rosy atmosphere, and, with the aid of the telescope, she could even see the glimmering twilight which the inner moon threw upon the unlighted portion of the planet's disk. Deimos grew bigger and bigger, and in about half an hour the Astronef grounded gently on what looked to Zadie like a dimly lighted circular plain, but which, when her eyes became accustomed to the light, was more like the summit of a conical mountain. Redgrave raised the keel a little from the surface again and steered towards a thin circle of light on the tiny horizon. As they crossed into the sunlit portion, it became quite plain that Deimos, at any rate, was as airless and lifeless as the moon. The surface was composed of brown rock and red sand broken up into miniature hills and valleys. There were a few traces of bygone volcanic action, but it was evident that the internal fires of this tiny world must have burnt themselves out very quickly. "Not much to be seen here," said Redgrave, as he came up the companion. "Way, and I don't think it would be safe to go out. The attraction is so weak here that we might find ourselves falling off with very little exertion. Still, you may as well take a couple of photographs of the surface, and then we'll be off to Phobos." Zadie got her apparatus to work, and when she had taken her slides down to the dark room, Redgrave turned the R-force on very slightly, and Phobos began to sink away beneath them. The attraction of Mars now began to make itself strongly felt, and the Astronef dropped rapidly through the 8,000 miles which separate the inner and outer satellites. As they approached Phobos, they saw that half the little disk was brilliantly lighted by the same rays of the sun which were glowing on the rapidly increasing crescent of Mars beneath them. By careful manipulation of his engines, Redgrave managed to meet the approaching satellite with a hardly perceptible shock about the centre of its lighted portion, that is to say, the side turned towards the planet. Mars now appeared as a gigantic rosy moon filling the whole vault of the heavens above them. Their telescopes brought the 3,750 miles down to about 10. The rapid motion of the tiny satellite afforded them a spectacle which might be compared to the rising of a moon glowing with rosy light and hundreds of times larger than the Earth. The speed of the vehicle of which they had taken possession, something like 4,200 miles an hour, caused the surface of the planet to apparently sweep away from below them, just as the Earth seems to glide from under the car of a balloon. Neither of them left the telescopes for more than a few minutes during this aerial circumnavigation. Murgatroyd, outwardly impassive but inwardly filled with solemn fears for the fate of this impiously daring voyage, brought them wine and sandwiches, and later on tea and toast and more sandwiches, but they took no moment's heed of these, so absorbed were they in the wonderful spectacle which was swiftly passing under their eyes. The main armament of the Astronef consisted of 4 pneumatic guns, which could be mounted on swivels, 2 ahead and 2 astern, which carried a shell containing either one of 2 kinds of explosives invented by her creator. One of these was a solid, and burst on impact with an explosive force equal to about 20 pounds of lyddite. The other consisted of 2 liquids separated by a partition in the shell, and these, when mixed by the breaking of the partition, burst into a volume of flame which could not be extinguished by any known human means. It would burn even in a vacuum, since it supplied its own elements of combustion. The guns would throw these shells to a distance of about 7 terrestrial miles. On the upper deck, there were also stands for a couple of light machine guns capable of discharging 700 explosive bullets a minute. Professor Rennick, although a man of peace, had little sympathy with the laws of civilized warfare, which permit men to be blown into rags of flesh and splinters of bone by explosive shells of a pound weight and upward, and only allow projectiles of less weight to be used against savages. There was no humbug about him. He believed that when war was necessary it had to be war, and the sooner it was over the better for everybody concerned. The small arms consisted of a couple of heavy 10-bore elephant guns carrying 3-ounce melanite shells, a dozen rifles and fowling pieces of different makes, of which 3, a single and a double-barreled rifle and a double-barreled shotgun, belonged to her ladyship, as well as a dainty brace of revolvers, one of half a dozen braces of various calibers which completed the minor armament of the Astronef. The guns were got up and mounted, while the attraction of the planet was comparatively feeble, and the weapons themselves therefore of very little weight. On the surface of the Earth, a score of men could not have done the work, but on board the Astronef, suspended in space, her crew of 3 found the work easy. Zadie herself picked up a Maxim and carried it about as though it were a toy sewing machine. "Now I think we can go down," said Redgrave, when everything had been put in position as far as possible. "I wonder whether we shall find the atmosphere of Mars suitable for terrestrial lungs. It will be rather awkward if it isn't." A very slight exertion of repulsive force was sufficient to detach the Astronef from the body of Phobos. She dropped rapidly towards the surface of the planet, and within 3 hours they saw the sunlight, for the first time since they had left the Earth, shining through an unmistakable atmosphere, an atmosphere of a pale, rosy hue instead of the azure of the earthly skies. An angular observation showed that they were within 50 miles of the surface of the undiscovered world. "Well, we shall find air here of some sort, there's no doubt. We'll drop a bit further, and then Andrew shall start the propellers. They'll very soon give us an idea of the density. Do you notice the change in the temperature? That's the diffused rays instead of the direct ones. 20 miles, I think that will do. I'll stop her now and we'll prospect for a landing place." He went down to apply the repulsive force directly to the surface of Mars so as to check the descent, and then he put on his breathing dress, went into the exit chamber, closed one door behind him, opened the other, and allowed it to fill with Martian air. Then he shut it again, opened his visor, and took a cautious breath. It may, perhaps, have been the idea that he, the first of all the sons of Earth, was breathing the air of another world. Or it might have been some property peculiar to the Martian atmosphere, but he immediately experienced a sensation such as usually follows the drinking of a glass of champagne. He took another breath, and another. Then he opened the inner door and went back to the lower deck, saying to himself, "Well, the air's all right if it is a bit champagne-y, rich in oxygen, I suppose, with perhaps a trace of nitrous oxide in it. Still, it's certainly breathable, and that's the principal thing." "It's all right, dear," he said as he reached the upper deck where Zadie was walking about round the sides of the glass dome, gazing with all her eyes at the strange scene of mingled cloud and sea and land which spread for an immense distance on all sides of them. "I have breathed the air of Mars, and even at this height it is distinctly wholesome. Though of course it's rather thin, and I had it mixed with some of our own atmosphere. Still, I think it will agree all right with us lower down." "Well then," said Zadie, "suppose we get below those clouds and see what there really is to be seen." "As there's a fairly big problem to be solved shortly, I'll see to the descent myself," he replied, going towards the stairway. In a couple of minutes she saw the cloud belt below them rising rapidly. When Redgrave returned, the Astronef was plunging into a sea of rosy mist. "The clouds of Mars!" she exclaimed. "Fancy a world with pink clouds. I wonder what there is on the other side." The next moment they saw. Just below them, at a distance of about 5 Earth miles, lay an irregularly triangular island, a detached portion of the continent of Huygens, almost equally divided by the Martian equator, and lying with another, almost similarly shaped island between the 40th and the 50th meridians of west longitude. The 2 islands were divided by a broad, straight stretch of water about the width of the English Channel between Folkestone and Boulogne. Instead of the bright blue-green of terrestrial seas, this connecting link between the great northern and southern Martian oceans had an orange tinge. The land immediately beneath them was of a gently undulating character, something like the downs of southeastern England. No mountains were visible in any direction. The lower portions, particularly along the borders of the canals and the sea, were thickly dotted with towns and cities, apparently of enormous extent. To the north of the island continent, there was a peninsula, which was covered with a vast collection of buildings, which, with the broad streets and spacious squares which divided them, must have covered an area of something like 200 square miles. "There's the London of Mars," said Redgrave, pointing down towards it, "where the London of Earth will be in a few thousand years, close to the equator. And, you see, all those other towns and cities are crowded round the canals. I dare say when we go across the northern and southern temperate zones we shall find them in about the state that Siberia or Antarctica are in." "I dare say we shall," replied Zadie. "Martian civilization is crowding towards the equator, though I should call that place down there the greater New York of Mars, and, see, there's Brooklyn just across the canal. I wonder what they're thinking about us down there." Phobos revolves from west to east almost along the plane of its primary's equator. To left and right they saw the huge ice caps of the south and north poles gleaming through the red atmosphere with a pale sunset glimmer. Then came the great stretches of sea, often obscured by vast banks of clouds, which, as the sunlight fell upon them, looked strangely like earth clouds at sunset. Then, almost immediately underneath them, spread out the great land areas of the equatorial region. The 4 continents of Haller, Galileo, and Tycholand, then Huygens, which is to Mars what Europe, Asia, and Africa are to the Earth, then Herschel and Copernicus. Nearly all of these land masses were split up into semi-regular divisions by the famous canals which have so long puzzled terrestrial observers. "Well, there is one problem solved at any rate," said Redgrave, when, after a journey of nearly 4 hours, they had crossed the Western Hemisphere. "Mars is getting very old, her seas are diminishing, and her continents are increasing. Those canals are the remains of gulfs and straits which have been widened and deepened and lengthened by human, or I should say Martian, labour, partly, I've no doubt, for purposes of navigation and partly to keep the inhabitants of the interior of the continents within measurable distance of the sea. There's not the slightest doubt about that. Then, you see, there are scarcely any mountains to speak of so far, only ranges of low hills. And that means, I suppose," said Zaidie, "that they've all been worn down as the mountains of the earth are being. I was reading Flammarion's End of the World last night, and he, you know, described the earth at the last as just one big plain of land, no hills or mountains, no seas, and only sluggish rivers draining into marshes. I suppose that is what they're coming to down yonder. Now, I wonder what sort of civilization we shall find. Perhaps we shan't find any at all. Suppose all their civilizations have worn out and they are degenerating into the same struggle for sheer existence those poor creatures in the moon must have had. Or suppose, said Redgrave rather seriously, we find that they have passed the zenith of civilization and are dropping back into savagery, but still have the use of weapons and means of destruction which we perhaps have no notion of and are inclined to use them. We'd better be careful, dear. What do you mean, Lennox? She said. They wouldn't try to do us any harm, would they? Why should they? I don't say they would, he replied, but still you never know. You see, their ideas of right and wrong and hospitality and all that sort of thing may be quite different to what we have on the earth. In fact, they may not be men at all, but just a sort of monster, with perhaps a superhuman intellect with all sorts of extra-human ideas in it. Then there's another thing, he went on. Suppose they fancied a trip through space, and thought that they had as good a right to the Astronef as we have. I dare say they've seen us by this time if they've got telescopes, as no doubt they have, perhaps a good deal more powerful than ours, and they may be getting ready to receive us now. I think I'll get the guns in place before we go down, in case their moral ideas, as dear old Hans Breitmann called them, are not quite the same as ours. Chapter 10. The words were hardly out of his mouth before Zaidie, who still had her glasses to her eyes, and was looking down towards the great city whose glazed roofs were flashing with 1,000 tints in the pale crimson sunlight, said with a little tremor in her voice, "Look, Lennox down there. Don't you see something coming up? That little black thing. Just look how fast it's coming up. It's quite distinct already. It's a sort of flying ship, only it has wings and, I think, masts too. Yes, I can see 3 masts, and there's something glittering on the tops of them. I wonder if they're coming to pay us a polite morning call, or whether they're going to treat us like trespassers in their atmosphere. There's no telling, but those things on the top of the masts look like revolving helices," replied Redgrave, after a long look through his telescope. "He's screwing himself up into the air. That shows that they must either have stronger and lighter machinery than we have, or, as the astronomers have thought, this atmosphere is denser than ours and therefore easier to fly in. Then, of course, things are only half their earthly weight here. Well, whether it's peace or war, I suppose we may as well let them come and reconnoitre. Then we shall see what kind of creatures they are. Ah, there are a lot more of them, some coming from Brooklyn too, as you call it. Come up into the conning tower, and I'll relieve Murgatroyd so that he can go and look after his engines. We shall have to give these gentlemen a lesson in flying. Meanwhile, in case of accidents, we may as well make ourselves as invulnerable as possible." A few minutes later, they were in the conning tower again, watching the approach of the Martian fleet through the thick windows of toughened glass, which enabled them to look in every direction except straight down. The steel coverings had been drawn down over the glass dome of the deck chamber, and Murgatroyd had gone down to the engine room. 50 feet ahead of them stretched out the long, shining spur, of which 10 feet was solid steel, a ram which no floating structure built by human hands could have resisted. Redgrave was standing with his hand on the steering wheel, looking more serious than he had done so far during the voyage. Zaidi stood beside him with a powerful binocular telescope watching, with cheeks a little paler than usual, the movements of the Martian airships. She counted 25 vessels rising round them in a wide circle. "I don't like the idea of a whole fleet coming up," said Redgrave, as he watched them rising and the ring narrowing round the still motionless Astronef. "If they only wanted to know who and what we are, or to leave their cards on us, as it were, and bid us welcome to the world, one ship could have done that just as well as a fleet. This lot coming up looks as if they wanted to get round and capture us." "It does look like it," said Zaidi, with her glasses fixed on the nearest of the vessels. "And now I can see they've guns too, something like ours, and perhaps, as you said just now, they may have explosives that we don't know anything about." "Oh, Lennox, suppose they were able to smash us up with a single shot." "You needn't be afraid of that, dear," he said, putting his arm round her shoulders. "Of course it's perfectly natural that they should look upon us with a certain amount of suspicion, dropping like this on them from the stars. Can you see anything like men on board them yet?" "No, they're all closed in just as we are," she replied. "But they've got conning towers like this, and something like windows along the sides. That's where the guns are, and the guns are moving. They're pointing them at us. Lennox, I'm afraid they're going to shoot." "Then we may as well spoil their aim," he said, pressing one of the buttons on the signal board 3 times, and then once more after a little interval. In obedience to the signal, Murgatroyd turned on the repulsive force to half power, and the Astronef leapt up vertically a couple of 1,000 feet. Then Redgrave pressed the button once and she stopped. Another signal set the propellers in motion, and as she sprang forward across the circle formed by the Martian airships, they looked down and saw that the place which they had just left was occupied by a thick greenish-yellow cloud. "Look, Lennox, what on earth is that?" exclaimed Zaidi, pointing down to it. "What on Mars would be nearer the point, dear?" he said, with what she thought a somewhat vicious laugh. "That, I'm afraid, means anything but a friendly reception for us. That cloud is one of 2 things. It's the smoke of the explosion of 20 or 30 shells, or else it's made of gases intended to either poison us or make us insensible so that they can take possession of the ship. In either case, I should say that the Martians are not what we should call gentlemen." "I should think not," she said angrily. "They might at least have taken us for friends till they had proved us enemies, which they wouldn't have done. Nice sort of hospitality that, considering how far we've come and we can't shoot back, because we haven't got the ports open." "And a very good thing too," laughed Redgrave. "If we had had them open, and that volley had caught us unawares, the Astronef would probably have been full of poisonous gases by this time, and your honeymoon, dear, would have come to a somewhat untimely end." "Ah, they're trying to follow us. Well, now we'll see how high they can fly." He sent another signal to Murgatroyd, and the Astronef, still beating the Martian air with the fans of her propellers and travelling forward at about 50 miles an hour, rose in a slanting direction through a dense bank of rosy-tinted clouds which hung over the bigger of the 2 cities, New York, as Zaidi had named it. When they reached the golden-red sunlight above it, the Astronef stopped her ascent, and then, with half a turn of the steering wheel, her commander sent her sweeping round in a wide circle. A few minutes later, they saw the Martian fleet rise almost simultaneously through the clouds. They seemed to hesitate a moment, and then the prow of every vessel was directed towards the swiftly moving Astronef. "Well, gentlemen," said Redgrave, "you evidently don't know anything about Professor Rennick and the R-Force, and yet you ought to know that we couldn't have come through space without being able to get beyond this little atmosphere of yours. Now let us see how fast you can fly." Another signal went down to Murgatroyd. The whirling propellers became 2 intersecting circles of light. The speed of the Astronef increased to 150 miles an hour, and the Martian fleet began to drop behind and trail out into a triangle like a flock of huge birds. "That's lovely. We're leaving them," exclaimed Zaidi, leaning forward with the glasses to her eyes and tapping the floor of the conning tower with her foot as if she wanted to dance. "And their wings are working faster than ever. They don't seem to have any screws." "Probably because they've solved the problem of bird's flight," said Redgrave. "They're not gaining on us, are they?" "No, they're at about the same distance." "Then we'll see how they can soar." Another signal went down the tube. The Astronef's propellers slowed down and stopped, and the vessel began to rise swiftly towards the zenith, which the sun was now approaching. The Martian fleet continued the impossible chase until the limits of the navigable atmosphere, about 8 Earth miles above the surface, was reached. Here the air was evidently too rarefied for their wings to act upon. They came to a standstill, looking like links of a broken chain, their occupants no doubt looking up with envious eyes upon the shining body of the Astronef, glittering like a tiny star in the sunlight 10,000 feet above them. "Well, gentlemen," said Redgrave after a swift glance round, "I think we have shown you that we can fly faster and soar higher than you can. Perhaps you'll be a bit more civil now. If you're not, we shall have to teach you manners. But you're not going to fight them all, dear, are you? Don't let us be the first to bring war and bloodshed with us into another world." "Don't trouble about that, little woman. It's here already," he replied, a trifle savagely. "People don't have airships and guns which fire shells or poison bombs or whatever they were without knowing what war is. From what I've seen, I should say, these Martians have civilized themselves out of all emotions and, I dare say, have fought pitilessly for the possession of the last habitable lands of the planet. They've preyed upon each other till only the fittest are left, and those, I suppose, were the ones who invented the airships and finally got possession of all that was worth having. Of course, that would give them the command of the planet, land and sea. In fact, if we are able to make the personal acquaintance of the Martians, we shall probably find them a set of over-civilized savages." "That's a rather striking paradox, isn't it, dear?" said Zadie, slipping her hand through his arm. "But still, it's not at all bad. You mean, of course, that they may have civilized themselves out of all the emotions until they're just a set of cold, calculating, scientific animals. After all, they must be something of the sort, for I'm quite sure we should not have done anything like that on Earth if we'd had a visitor from Mars. We shouldn't have got out cannons and shot at him before we'd even made his acquaintance. Now, if he or they had dropped in America as we were going down there, we should have received them with deputations, given them banquets, which they might not have been able to eat, and speeches, which they would not understand, and photographed them, and filled the newspapers with everything that we could imagine about them, and then put them in a palace car and hustled them round the country for everybody to look at. And meanwhile, laughed Redgrave, some of your smart engineers, I suppose, would have gone over the vessel they had come in, found out how she was worked, and taken out a dozen patents for her machinery." "Very likely," replied Zadie, with a saucy little toss of her chin, "and why not? We like to learn things down there, and anyhow that would be much more really civilized than shooting at them." While this little conversation was going on, the Astronef was dropping rapidly into the midst of the Martian fleet, which had again arranged itself in a circle. Zadie soon made out through her glasses that the guns were pointed upwards. "Oh, that's your little game, is it?" said Redgrave when she had told him of this. "Well, if you want a fight, you can have it." As he said this, his jaws came together, and Zadie saw a look in his eyes that she had never seen there before. He signalled rapidly 2 or 3 times to Murgatroyd. The propellers began to whirl at their utmost speed, and the Astronef, making a spiral downward course, swooped down onto the Martian fleet with terrific velocity. Her last curve coincided almost exactly with the circle occupied by the ships. Half a dozen spouts of greenish flame came from the nearest vessel, and for a moment the Astronef was enveloped in a yellow mist. Evidently they don't know that we are airtight, and they don't use shot or shell. They've got past that. Their projectiles kill by poison or suffocation. I dare say a volley like that would kill a regiment. Now I'll give that fellow a lesson which he won't live to remember." They swept through the poison mist. Redgrave swung the wheel round. The Astronef dropped to the level of the ring of Martian vessels which had now got up speed again. Her steel ram was directed straight at the vessel which had fired the last shot. Propelled at a speed of nearly 200 miles an hour, it took the strange winged craft amidships. As the shock came, Redgrave put his arm round Zadie's waist and held her close to him, otherwise she would have been flung against the forward wall of the conning tower. The Martian vessel stopped and bent up. They saw human figures more than half as large again, as men inside her staring at them through the windows in the sides. There were others at the breeches of the guns in the act of turning the muzzles on the Astronef. But this was only a momentary glimpse, for in a second the Astronef's spur had pierced her, the Martian airship broke in twain, and her 2 halves plunged downwards through the rosy clouds. "Keep her at full speed, Andrew," said Redgrave down the speaking tube, "and stand by to jump if we want to." "All ready, my lord," came back up the tube. The old Yorkshireman during the last few minutes had undergone a transformation which he himself hardly understood. He recognised that there was a fight going on, that it was a case of burn, sink and destroy, and the 1,000-year-old berserker awoke in him just, as a matter of fact, it had done in his lordship. "They can pick up the pieces down there, what there is left of them," said Redgrave, still holding Zadie tight to his side with one hand and working the wheel with the other, "and now we'll teach them another lesson." "What are you going to do, dear?" she said, looking up at him with somewhat frightened eyes. "You'll see in a moment," he said between his shut teeth. "I don't care whether these Martians are degenerate human beings or only animals, but from my point of view the reception they have given us justifies any kind of retaliation. If we'd had a single porthole open during the first volley, you and I would have been dead by this time, and I'm not going to stand anything like that without reprisals. They've declared war on us, and killing in war isn't murder. Well, no, I suppose not, she said, but it's the first fight I've been in and I don't like it. Still, they did receive us pretty meanly, didn't they? Meanly? If there was anything like a code of interplanetary morals or manners, one might call it absolutely caddish. I don't believe even Stead himself could stand that, unless, of course, he wasn't here. He sent another message to Murgatroyd. The Astronef sprang 1,000 feet towards the zenith, another touch on the button, and she stopped exactly over the biggest of the Martian airships, another, and she dropped onto it like a stone and smashed it to fragments. Then she stopped and mounted again above the broken circle of the fleet, while the pieces of the airship, and what was left of her crew, plunged downwards through the crimson clouds in a fall of nearly 30,000 feet. Within the next few moments the rest of the Martian fleet had followed it, sinking rapidly down through the clouds and scattering in all directions. "They seem to have had enough of it," laughed Redgrave, as the Astronef, in obedience to another signal, began to drop towards the surface of Mars. "Now we'll go down and see if they're in a more reasonable frame of mind. At any rate, we've won our first scrimmage, dear." But it was rather brutal, Lennox, wasn't it? When you are dealing with brutes, little woman, it is sometimes necessary to be brutal. "And you look a wee bit brutal right now," she replied, looking up at him with something like a look of fear in her eyes. "I suppose that is because you have just killed somebody, or somethings, whichever they are." "Do I really?" The hard-set jaw relaxed and his lips melted into a smile under his moustache, and he bent down and kissed her. "Well, what do you suppose I should have thought of them if you had had a whiff of that poison?" "Yes, dear," she whispered in between the kisses. "I see now." Chapter 11. The Astronef dropped swiftly down through the crimson-tinged clouds, and a few minutes later they saw that the rest of the fleet had scattered in units in all directions, apparently with the intention of getting as far as possible out of reach of that terrible ram. Only one of them, the largest, which carried what looked like a flag of woven gold at the top of its centre mast, remained in sight after a few minutes. It was almost immediately below them when they had passed through the clouds, and they could see it sinking straight down towards the centre of what appeared to be the principal square of the bigger of the two cities, which Zadie had named New York and Brooklyn. "That fellow has gone to report, evidently," said Redgrave. "We'll follow him just to see what he's up to, but I don't think we'd better open the ports even then. There's no telling when they might give us a whiff of that poison mist or whatever it is. But how are you going to talk to them then, if they can talk? I mean, if they know any language that we do. They're something like men, and so I suppose they understand the language of signs at any rate. Still, if you don't fancy it, we'll go somewhere else." "No, thanks," she said. "That's not my father's daughter. I haven't come 100 million miles from home to go away before the first act's finished. We'll go down to see if we can make them understand." By this time, the Astronef was hanging suspended over an enormous square about half the size of Hyde Park. It was laid out just as a terrestrial park would be, in grassland, flower beds and avenues, and patches of trees. Only the grass was a reddish yellow. The leaves of the trees were like those of a beech in autumn, and the flowers were nearly all a deep violet or a bright emerald green. As they descended, they saw that the square, or Central Park, as Zadie at once christened it, was flanked by enormous blocks of buildings, palaces built of a dazzlingly white stone, and topped by domed roofs and lofty cupolas of glass. "Isn't that just lovely?" she said, swinging her binoculars in every direction. "Talk about your Park Lane and the houses round Central Park. Why, it's the Chicago Exposition and the Paris one and your Crystal Palace, multiplied by about 10,000, and all spread out just round this one place. If we don't find these people nice, I guess we'd better go back and build a fleet like this and come and take it." "There spoke the new American imperialism," laughed Redgrave. "Well, we'll go and see what they're like first, shall we?" The Astronef dropped a little more slowly than the airship had done, and remained suspended 100 feet or so above her after she had reached the ground. Swarms of human figures, but of more than human stature, clad in tunics and trousers or knickerbockers, came out of the glass-domed palaces from all sides into the park. They were nearly all of the same stature, and there appeared to be no difference whatever between the sexes. Their dress was absolutely plain. There was no attempt at ornament or decoration of any kind. "If there are any of the Martian women among those people," said her ladyship, "they've taken to rationals, and they've grown about as big as the men. That's exactly what's happening on Earth, you know, dear. I don't mean about the rationals, but the women growing up, especially in America. I come of a pretty long family. But look. Well, I only come to your ear, she said, and are descendants of 10,000 years hence. Oh, don't bother about them, she said. Look, there's someone who seems to want to communicate with us. Why, they're all bald. They haven't got a hair among them, and what a size their heads are. That's brains, too much brains in fact. These people have lived too long. I dare say they've ceased to be animals, civilized themselves out of everything in the way of passions and emotions, and are just purely intellectual beings with as much human nature about them as Russian diplomacy or those things we saw at the bottom of the Newton crater. I don't like the look of them. The orderly swarms of figures, which were rapidly filling the park, divided as he was speaking, making a broad lane from one of its entrances to where the Astronef was hanging above the airship. A light four-wheeled vehicle, whose framework and wheels glittered like burnished gold, sped towards them, driven by some invisible agency. Its only occupant was a huge man, dressed in the universal costume, saving only a scarlet sash in place of the cord girdle which the others wore round their waists. The vehicle stopped near the airship, over which the Astronef was hanging, and, as the figure dismounted, a door opened in the side of the vessel, and 3 other figures, similar both in stature and attire, came out and entered into conversation with him. "The Admiral of the fleet is evidently making his report," said Redgrave. "Meanwhile, the crowd seems to be taking a considerable amount of interest in us." "And very naturally too," replied Zaidie. "Don't you think we might go down now and see if we can make ourselves understood in any way? You can have the guns ready in case of accidents, but I don't think they'll try and hurt us now. Look, the gentleman with the red sash is making signs." "I think we can go down now all right," replied Redgrave, "because it's quite certain they can't use the poison guns on us without killing themselves as well. Still, we may as well have our own ready. Andrew, get that Port Maxim ready. I hope we shan't want it, but we may. I don't quite like the look of these people." "They're very ugly, aren't they?" said Zaidie, "and really you can't tell which are men and which are women. I suppose they've civilized themselves out of everything that's nice, and are just scientific and utilitarian and everything that's horrid. I shouldn't wonder. They look to me as if they've just got common sense, as we call it, and haven't any other sense. But, at any rate, if they don't behave themselves, we shall be able to teach them manners of a sort, though we may possibly have done that to some extent already." As he said this, Redgrave went into the conning tower, and the Astronef moved from above the airship and dropped gently into the crimson grass about 100 feet from her. Then the ports were opened, the guns, which Murgatroyd had loaded, were swung into position, and they armed themselves with a brace of revolvers each in case of accident. "What delicious air this is," said her ladyship, as the ports were opened and she took her first breath of the Martian atmosphere. "It's ever so much nicer than ours. Oh, Lennox, it's just like breathing champagne." Redgrave looked at her with an admiration which was tempered by a sudden apprehension. Even in his eyes she had never seemed so lovely before. Her cheeks were glowing, and her eyes were gleaming with a brightness that was almost feverish, and he was himself sensible of a strange feeling of exultation, both mental and physical, as his lungs filled with the Martian air. "Oxygen," he said, shortly, "and too much of it. Or I shouldn't wonder if it was something like nitrous oxide, you know, laughing gas." "Don't," she laughed. "It may be very nice to breathe, but it reminds one of other things which aren't a bit nice. Still, if it is anything of that sort, it might account for these people having lived so fast. I know I feel just now as if I was living at the rate of 36 hours a day, and so, I suppose, the fewer hours we stop here the better." "Exactly," said Redgrave, with another glance of apprehension at her. "Now, there's His Royal Highness, or whatever he is, coming. How are we going to talk to him?" "Are you all ready, Andrew?" "Yes, my lord, all ready," replied the old Yorkshireman, dropping his huge, hairy hand on the breech of the Maxim. "Very well, then, shoot the moment you see them doing anything suspicious, and don't let anyone except His Royal Highness come nearer than 100 yards. As he said this, Redgrave went to the door, from which the gangway steps had been lowered, and, in reply to a singularly expressive gesture from the huge Martian, who seemed to stand nearly 9 feet high, he beckoned to him to come up onto the deck. As he mounted the steps, the crowd closed round the Astronef and the Martian airship, but, as though in obedience to orders which had already been given, they kept at a respectful distance of a little over 100 yards away from the strange vessel which had wrought such havoc with their fleet. When the Martian reached the deck, Redgrave held out his hand and the giant recoiled, as a man on Earth might have done if, instead of the open palm, he had seen a clenched hand gripping a knife. "Take care, Lennox," exclaimed Zadie, taking a couple of steps towards him with her right hand on the butt of one of her revolvers. And the movement brought her close to the open door, and in full view of the crowd outside. If a seraph had come on Earth and presented itself thus before a throng of human beings, there might have happened some such miracle as was wrought when the swarm of Martians beheld the strange beauty of this radiant daughter of the Earth. As it seemed to the space, voyagers, when they discussed it afterwards, ages of purely utilitarian civilization had brought all conditions of Martian life up, or down, to the same level. There was no apparent difference between the males and females in stature. Their faces were all the same, with features of mathematical regularity, pale skin, bloodless cheeks, and an expression, if such it could be called, utterly devoid of emotion. But still these creatures were human, or at least their forefathers had been. Hearts beat in their breasts, blood of a sort still flowed through their veins, and so the magic of this marvelous vision instantly awoke the long slumbering elementary instincts of a bygone age. A low murmur ran through the vast throng, a murmur half human, half brutish, which swiftly rose to a hoarse, screaming roar. "Look out, my lord! Quick! Shut the door! They're coming! It's her ladyship they want. She must look like an angel from heaven to them. Shall I fire?" "Yes," said Redgrave, gripping the lever and bringing the door down. "Zadie, if this fellow moves, put a bullet through him. I'm going to talk to that airship before he gets his poison guns to work." As the last word left his lips, Murgatroyd put his thumb on the spring on the Maxim. A roar, such as Martian ears had never heard before, resounded through the vast square, and was flung back with 1,000 echoes from the walls of the huge palaces on every side. A stream of smoke and flame poured out of the little porthole, and then the onward swarming throng seemed to stop, and the front ranks of it began to sink down silently in long rows. Then through the roaring rattle of the Maxim sounded the deep, sharp bang of Redgrave's gun, as he sent 10 pounds weight of rennicite, as he had christened it, into the Martian airship. There was the roar of an explosion which shook the air for miles around. A blaze of greenish flame and a huge cloud of steamy smoke showed that the projectile had done its work, and, when the smoke drifted away, the spot on which the airship had lain was only a deep, red, jagged gash in the ground. There was not even a fragment of the ship to be seen. This done, Redgrave went and turned the starboard Maxim onto another swarm which was approaching the Astronef from that side. When he had got the range, he swung the gun slowly from side to side. The moving throng stopped, as the other one had done, and sank down to the red grass, now dyed with a deeper red. Meanwhile, Zadie had been holding the Martian at something more than arm's length with her revolver. He seemed to understand perfectly that, if she pulled the trigger, the revolver would do something like what the Maxims had done. He appeared to take no notice whatever, either of the destruction of the airship or of the slaughter that was going on around the Astronef. His big, pale blue eyes were fixed upon her face. They seemed to be devouring a loveliness such as they had never seen before. A dim, pinky flush stole for the first time into his waxy cheeks, and something like a light of human passion came into his eyes. Then, to the utter astonishment of both Redgrave and Zadie, he said slowly and deliberately, and with only just enough tinge of emotion in his voice to make Redgrave want to shoot him, "Beautiful, perfect, more perfect than ours, I want it. Give palace and garden of eternal summer for it. 2,000 work slaves and 50. And I'll see you damned first, sir, whoever you are," said Redgrave, clapping his hand onto the butt of his revolver, and forgetting for the moment that he was speaking in another world than his own. "What the devil do you mean, sir, by insulting my wife?" "Insulting? Wife? What is that? We have no words like those." "But you speak English," exclaimed Zadie, going a little nearer to him, but still keeping the muzzle of her revolver pointing up to his hairless head. "No, Lennox, don't be afraid about me, and don't get angry. Can't you see that this person hasn't got any temper? I suppose it was civilized out of his ancestors ages ago. He doesn't know what a wife or an insult is. He just looks upon me as a desirable piece of property to be bought, and I dare say he offered you a very handsome price. Now, don't look so savage, because you know bargains like that have been made even on our dear old virtuous Mother Earth. For instance, if you hadn't met us in the middle of the Atlantic—" "That'll do, Zadie," Redgrave interrupted almost roughly. "That's not exactly the question, but I see what you mean, and it was a bit silly of me to get angry." "Silly? Angry? What do those words mean?" said the Martian in his slow, passionless, mechanical voice. "Who are you? Whence come you?" I'll answer the last part first, said Redgrave. We come from the Earth, the planet which you see after sunset and before sunrise. Yes, the Silver Star, said the Martian without any note of wonder or surprise in his voice. Are all the dwellers there like the gods and angels our children read about in the old legends? Gods and angels, laughed Zadie. There, Lennox, there's a compliment for you. I really think we ought to be as civil to His Royal Highness after that as possible. Then she went on, addressing the Martian. No, we are not all gods and angels on Earth. There are no gods and very few angels. In fact, there are none except those which exist in the fancy of certain prejudiced persons. But that doesn't matter, at least not just now, she continued with American directness. What we want to know just now is why you speak English and what sort of a world this Mars is. The Martian evidently only understood the most direct essentials of her speech. He saw that she asked 2 questions, and he answered them. Speak English? He replied with a little shake of his huge head. We know not English, but there is no other speech. There is only ours. Cycles ago there were other speeches here, but those who spoke them were killed. It was inconvenient. One speech for a world is best. I see what he means, said Redgrave, looking towards Zadie. The Martian people have developed along practically the same lines as we are doing, but they have done it faster and got a long way ahead of us. We are finding out that the speech we call English is the shortest and most convenient. The Martians found it out long ago and killed everybody who spoke anything else. After all, what we call speech is only the translation of thoughts into sounds. These people have been thinking for ages with the same sort of brains as ours, and they've translated their thoughts into the same sounds. What we call English they, I dare say, call Martian, and that's all there is in it that I can see. Of course, laughed Zadie. Wonderful until you know how, eh? Like most things. Still, I must say that our friend here speaks English something like a phonograph, and if he'll excuse me saying so, which of course he will, he doesn't seem to have much more human nature about him. I'm not quite so sure on that point, said Redgrave, but— Oh, never mind about that now, she interrupted, and then, turning towards the Martian, who had been listening intently as though he was trying to make sense out of what they had been saying, she went on speaking slowly and very plainly. Tell me, sir, if you please, do you know what angry means? Are you not angry with us for destroying your airships up there in the clouds, and the one that came down, and for shooting all those people of yours? The Martian looked at her with a little light in his big blue eyes, and 2 faint little spots of red just under them, and said, Anger. Yes, I remember. That is what we call brain heat. Our teachers found it to be madness, and it was abolished. It was not convenient. The airships were not convenient to you, so you abolished them. A folk, too, that you abolished with those things, pointing to the guns. They were not convenient. If you hadn't done that, they would have abolished you. There is no more to say. What brutes, said Zadie, turning away from him, her head thrown back and her lips curling in unutterable disgust. Well, if these people have civilized themselves along the same lines that we are doing, thinking the same things and speaking something like the same speech, thank God we shall be dead before our civilization reaches a stage like this. That's not a man. It's only a machine of flesh and bone and nerves, and I suppose it has blood of some sort. A beautiful woman always looks most beautiful when she is just a little angry. Redgrave had never seen Zadie look quite so lovely as she did just then. The Martian, whose ancestors had for generations forgotten what human emotion was like, only saw in her anger a miracle which made her 1,000 times more beautiful than before. And as he looked upon her glowing cheeks and gleaming eyes, some instinct insensibly transmitted through many generations awoke to sudden life in some unused corner of his brain. His pale, clear eyes lit up with something like a glow of human passion. The pink spots under his eyes spread downwards over his cheeks. Some half-articulate sounds came from between his thin lips. Then they were drawn back and showed his smooth, toothless gums. He took a couple of long, swift strides towards her, and then bent forward, towering over her with long, outstretched arms, huge, hideous, and half-human. Zadie sprang backwards as he came towards her. Her right hand went up, and just as Redgrave levelled his revolver, and Murgatroyd, true to the old berserk instinct, took a rifle by the barrel and swung the stock above his head, Zadie pulled her trigger. The bullet cut a clean hole through the smooth, hairless skull of the Martian. A dark, red spot came just between his eyes. His huge frame shrank together and collapsed in a heap on the deck. "Oh, I've killed him! God forgive me, killed a man!" she whispered as her hand fell to her side and the revolver dropped from her fingers. But, Lennox, do you really think it was a man? That thing a man, he replied between his clenched teeth. He wanted you and spoke English of a sort, so there was something human about him, but anyhow he's better dead. Here, Andrew, open that door again and help me to heave this thing overboard. Then I think we'd better be off before we have the rest of the fleet with their poison guns round us. Zadie, I think you'd better go to your room for the present. Take a nip of cognac and then lie down, and mind you keep the door tight shut. There's no telling what these animals might do if they had a chance, and just now it's my business and Andrew's to see that they don't. Though she would much rather have remained on deck to see anything more that might happen, she saw that he was really in earnest, and so like a wise wife who commands by obeying, she obeyed and went below. Then the dead body of the Martian was tumbled out of the side door. The windows through which the guns had been fired were hermetically closed, and a few minutes later the Astronef vanished from the surface of Mars, to remain a memory and a marvel to the dwindling generations of the worn-out world, which is as this may be in the far-off days that are to come. Chapter 12. How very different Venus looks now to what it does from the Earth, said Zadie, a couple of mornings later, by Earth time, as she took her eye away from the telescope through which she had been examining an enormous golden crescent which spanned the dark vault of space ahead of and slightly below the Astronef. Yes, replied Redgrave, she looks— How do you know that she is a she? Said Zadie, getting up and laying a hand on his shoulder as he sat at his own telescope. Of course I know what you mean, that according to our own ideas on Earth, it is the planet, or the world, which has been supposed for ages to, as it were, shine upon the lovers of Earth with the light reflected from well, I suppose you know what I mean. Seeing that you are the most perfect terrestrial incarnation of the said goddess that I have seen yet, he replied, flipping his arm round her waist and pulling her down onto his knees, I don't think that that is quite the view you ought to take. Surely if Venus ever had a daughter— Oh, nonsense. After we've travelled all these millions of miles together, do you really expect me to believe stuff like that? My dear girl graduate, he said, tightening his grip round her waist a little, you know perfectly well that if we had travelled beyond the limits of the solar system, if we had outsailed old Halley's comet itself and dived into the uttermost depths of space outside the Milky Way, you and I would still be a man and a woman, and, being, as may be presumed, more or less in love with each other. Less indeed, said Zadie. You're speaking for yourself, I hope. And then when she had partially disengaged herself and sat up straight, she said between her laughs, Really, Lennox, you're quite absurd for a person who has been married as long as you have. I don't mean in time, but in space. Was it 1,000 years, or a couple of 100 million miles ago that we were married? Really, I am getting my ideas of time and space quite mixed up. But never mind that. What I was going to say is that, according to all the authorities which your girl graduate has been reading since we left Mars, Venus— oh, doesn't she look just gorgeous? And our old friend the sun behind there blazing out of darkness like one of the furnaces at Pittsburgh. I beg your pardon, Lennox, I'm afraid I'm getting quite provincial. I suppose we're considerably more than 100 million miles away. Yes, dear, we're about 150 millions, and at that distance, if you'll excuse me saying so, even the United States would seem almost like a province, wouldn't they? Well, yes, that's just where distance doesn't lend enchantment to the view, I suppose. But what was it you were going to say before that? The interlude, eh? How before the interlude you were accusing me of being a graduate, as well as a girl. Of course I can't help that, but what I was going to say was, if you are going to talk science, dear, perhaps we'd better sit on different chairs. I may have been married for 150 million miles, but the honeymoon isn't halfway through yet, you know. Then there was another interlude of a few seconds' duration. When Zadie was seated beside her own telescope again, she said, after another glance at the splendid crescent which, as the Astronef approached at a speed of over 40 miles a second, increased in size and distinctness every moment. What I mean is this. All the authorities are agreed that on Venus, her axis of revolution being so very much inclined to the plane of her orbit, the seasons are so severe that half the year its temperate zone and its tropics have a summer about twice as hot as ours, and the other half they have a winter twice as cold as our coldest. I'm afraid, after all, we shall find the Love Star a world of salamanders and seals, things that can live in a furnace and bask on an iceberg, and when we get back home it will be our painful duty, as the first explorers of the fields of space, to dispel another dearly cherished popular delusion. I'm not so very sure about that, said Lennox, glancing from the rapidly growing crescent to the sweet, smiling face beside him. Don't you see something very different there to what we saw either on the Moon or Mars? Now just go back to your telescope and let us take an observation. Well, said Zadie, rising, as our trip is, partly at least in the interests of science, I will, and then, when she had got her own telescope into focus again, for the distance between the Astronef and the new world they were about to visit was rapidly lessening, she took a long look through it and said, Yes, I think I see what you mean. The outer edge of the crescent is bright, but it gets greyer and dimmer towards the inside of the curve. Of course, Venus has an atmosphere. So had Mars, but this must be very dense. There's a sort of halo all round it. Just fancy that splendid thing being the little black spot we saw going across the face of the sun a few days ago. It makes one feel rather small, doesn't it? That is one of the things which a woman says when she doesn't want to be answered, but apart from that, you were saying, what a very unpleasant person you can be when you like. I was going to say that on the Moon we saw nothing but black and white, light and darkness. There was no atmosphere, except in those awful places I don't want to think about. Then, as we got near Mars, we saw a pinky atmosphere, but not very dense. But this, you see, is a sort of pearl-grey-white shading from silver to black. You notice how much paler it grows as we get nearer. But look, what are those tiny bright spots? There are hundreds of them. Do you remember as we were leaving the Earth, how bright the mountain ranges looked, how plainly we could see the Rockies and the Andes? Oh yes, I see, they're mountains, 37 miles high, some of them, they say, and the rest of the silver grey will be clouds, I suppose. Fancy living under clouds like those. Only another case of the adaptation of life to natural conditions, I expect. When we get there, I dare say we shall find that these clouds are just what make it possible for the inhabitants of Venus to stand the extremes of heat and cold. Given elevations 3 or 4 times as high as the Himalayas, it would be quite possible for them to choose their temperature by shifting their altitude. But I think it's about time to drop theory and see to the practice, he continued, getting up from his chair and going to the signal board in the conning tower. Whatever the planet Venus may be like, we don't want to charge it at the rate of 60 miles a second. That's about the speed now, considering how fast she's travelling towards us. And considering that, whether it is a nice world or not, it's nearly as big as the Earth, I guess we should get rather the worst of the charge, laughed Zadie as she went back to her telescope. Redgrave sent a signal down to Murgatroyd to reverse engines, as it were, or, in other words, to direct the R force against the planet, from which they were now only a couple of 100,000 miles distant. The next moment, the sun and stars seemed to halt in their courses. The great golden grey crescent, which had been increasing in size every moment, appeared to remain stationary, and then, when he was satisfied that the engines were developing the force properly, he sent another signal down, and the Astronef began to descend. The half-disk of Venus seemed to fall below them, and in a few minutes they could see it from the upper deck, spreading out like a huge semicircular plane of light ahead and on both sides of them. The Astronef was falling at the rate of about 1,000 miles a minute towards the centre of the half-crescent, and every moment the brilliant spots above the cloud surface grew in size and brightness. I believe the theory about the enormous height of the mountains of Venus must be correct after all, said Redgrave, tearing himself with an evident wrench away from his telescope. Those white patches can't be anything else but the summits of snow-capped mountains. You know how brilliantly white a snow peak looks on Earth against the whitest of clouds. Oh yes, said Zadie, I've often seen that in the Rockies. But it's lunchtime, and I must go down and see how my things in the kitchen are getting on. I suppose you'll try and land somewhere where it's morning, so that we can have a good day before us. Really, it's very convenient to be able to make your own morning or night as you like, isn't it? I hope it won't make us too conceited when we get back, being able to choose our mornings and our evenings, in fact, our sunrises and sunsets on any world we like to visit in a casual way like this. Well, laughed Redgrave, as she moved away towards the companion stairs, after all, if you find the United States, or even the planet Terra, too small for you, we've always got the fields of space open to us. We might take a trip across the Zodiac, or down the Milky Way. And meanwhile, she replied, stopping at the top of the stairs and looking round, I'll go down and get lunch. You and I may be king and queen of the realms of space and all that sort of thing, but we've got to eat and drink after all. And that reminds me, said Redgrave, getting up and following her, we must celebrate our arrival on a new world as usual. I'll go down and get out the wine. I shouldn't be surprised if we found the people of the love world living on nectar and ambrosia, and as fizz is our nearest approach to nectar. I suppose, said Zadie, as she gathered up her skirts and stepped daintily down the companion stairs, if you find anything human, or at least human enough to eat and drink, you'll have a party and give them champagne. I wonder what those wretches on Mars would have thought of it if we'd only made friends with them. Her lunch on board the Astronef was about the pleasantest meal of the day. Of course, there was neither day nor night, in the ordinary sense of the word, except as the hours were measured off by the chronometers. Whichever side or end of the vessel received the direct rays of the sun was bathed in blazing heat and dazzling light. Elsewhere there was black darkness and the more than icy cold of space. But lunch was a convenient division of the waking hours, which began with a stroll on the upper deck and a view of the ever-varying splendours about them, and ended after dinner in the same place with coffee and cigarettes and speculations as to the next day's happenings. This lunch hour passed even more pleasantly and rapidly than others had done, for the discussion as to the possibilities of Venus was continued in a quite delightful mixture of scientific disquisition and that converse which is common to most human beings on their honeymoon. As there was nothing more to be done or seen for an hour or two, the afternoon was spent in a pleasant siesta in the luxurious deck saloon, because evening to them would be morning on that portion of Venus to which they were directing their course. And, as Zadie said, when she subsided into her hammock, it would be breakfast time before they could get dinner. As the Astronef fell with ever-increasing velocity towards the cloud-covered surface of Venus, the remainder of her disk, lit up by the radiance of her sister worlds, Mercury, Mars, and the Earth, and also by the pale radiance of an enormous comet which had suddenly shot into view from behind its southern limb, became more or less visible. Towards 6 o'clock, it became necessary to exert nearly the whole strength of her engines to check the velocity of her fall. By 8, she had entered the atmosphere of Venus, and was dropping slowly towards a vast sea of sunlit cloud, out of which, on all sides, towered thousands of snow-clad peaks, rounded summits, and widespread stretches of upland, about which the clouds swept and surged like the silent billows of some vast ocean in Ghostland. I thought so, said Redgrave, when the propellers had begun to revolve, and Murgatroyd had taken his place in the conning tower. A very dense atmosphere loaded with clouds. There's the sun just rising, so your ladyship's wishes are duly obeyed. And doesn't it seem nice and homelike to see him rising through an atmosphere above the clouds again? It doesn't look a bit like the same sort of dear old sun just blazing like a red-hot moon among a lot of white-hot stars and planets. Look, aren't those peaks lovely, and that cloud sea? Why, for all the world we might be in a balloon above the Rockies or the Alps. And see, she continued, pointing to one of the thermometers fixed outside the glass dome which covered the upper deck, it's only 65 even here. I wonder if we can breathe this air, and oh, I do wonder what we shall see on the other side of those clouds. You shall have both questions answered in a few minutes, replied Redgrave, going towards the conning tower. To begin with, I think we'll land on that big snow dome yonder, and do a little exploring. Where there are snow and clouds, there is moisture, and where there is moisture, a man ought to be able to breathe. The Astronef, still falling, but now easily under the command of the helmsman, shot forwards and downwards towards a vast dome of snow which, rising some 2,000 feet above the cloud sea, shone with dazzling brilliance in the light of the rising sun. She landed just above the edge of the clouds. Meanwhile, they had put on their breathing suits, and Redgrave had seen that the air chamber through which they had to pass from their own little world into the new ones that they visited was in working order. When the outer door was opened and the ladder lowered, he stood aside, as he had done on the moon, and Zadie's was the first human foot which made an imprint on the virgin snows of Venus. The first thing Redgrave did was to raise the visor of his helmet and taste the air of the new world. It was cool and fresh and sweet, and the first draught of it sent the blood tingling and dancing through his veins. Perfect as the arrangements of the Astronef were in this respect, the air of Venus tasted like clear running spring water would have done to a man who had been drinking filtered water for several days. He threw the visor right up and motioned to Zadie to do the same. She obeyed, and, after drawing a long breath, she said, "That's glorious." It's like wine after water, and rather stagnant water too. But what a world! Snow peaks and cloud seas, islands of ice and snow in an ocean of mist. Just look at them. Did you ever see anything so lovely and unearthly in your life? I wonder how high this mountain is, and what there is on the other side of the clouds. Isn't the air delicious? Not a bit too cold after all. But still, I think we may as well go back and put on something more becoming. I shouldn't quite like the ladies of Venus to see me dressed like a diver." "Come along then," laughed Lennox, as he turned back towards the vessel. "That's just like a woman. You're about 150 million miles away from Broadway or Regent Street. You are standing on the top of a snow mountain above the clouds of Venus, and the moment that you find the air is fit to breathe, you begin thinking about dress. How do you know that the inhabitants of Venus, if there are any, dress at all? What nonsense, of course they do. At least, if they're anything like us." As soon as they got back on board the Astronef and had taken their breathing dresses off, Redgrave and the old engineer, who appeared to take no visible interest in their new surroundings, threw open all the sliding doors on the upper and lower decks so that the vessel might be thoroughly ventilated by the fresh, sweet air. And a gentle repulsion was applied to the huge snow mass on which the Astronef rested. She rose a couple of 100 feet, her propellers began to whirl round, and Redgrave steered her out towards the centre of the vast cloud sea, which was almost surrounded by 1,000 glittering peaks of ice and domes of snow. "I think we may as well put off dinner, or breakfast as it will be now, until we see what the world below is like," he said to Zaidie, who was standing beside him on the conning tower. "Oh, never mind about eating just now. This is altogether too wonderful to be missed for the sake of ordinary meat and drink. Let's go down and see what there is on the other side." He sent a message down the speaking tube to Murgatroyd, who was below among his beloved engines, and the next moment sun and clouds and ice peaks had disappeared, and nothing was visible save the all-enveloping silver-grey mist. For several minutes they remained silent, watching and wondering what they would find beneath the veil which hid the surface of Venus from their view. Then the mist thinned out and broke up into patches which drifted past them as they descended on their downward slanting course. Below them they saw vast, ghostly shapes of mountains and valleys, lakes and rivers, continents, islands and seas. Every moment these became more and more distinct, and soon they were in full view of the most marvellous landscape that human eyes had ever beheld. The distances were tremendous. Mountains, compared with which the Alps or even the Andes would have seemed mere hillocks, towered up out of the vast depths beneath them. Up to the lower edge of the all-covering cloud sea, they were clad with a golden yellow vegetation, fields and forests open, smiling valleys, and deep dark ravines through which 1,000 torrents thundered down from the eternal snows beyond to spread themselves out in rivers and lakes in the valleys and plains which lay many thousands of feet below. "What a lovely world," said Zaidie, as she at last found her voice after what was almost a stupor of speechless wonder and admiration. "And the light. Did you ever see anything like it? It's neither moonlight nor sunlight. See, there are no shadows down there, it's just all lovely silvery twilight. Lennox, if Venus is as nice as she looks from here, I don't think I shall want to go back. It reminds me of Tennyson's Lotus Eaters, the land where it is always afternoon. I think you are right after all. We are 30 million miles nearer to the sun than we were on the Earth, and the light and heat have to filter through those clouds. They are not at all like Earth clouds from this side. It's the other way about. The silver lining is on this side. And look, there isn't a black or a brown one, or even a grey one within sight. They are just like a thin mist, lighted by 1,000,000 of electric lamps. It's a delicious world, and if it isn't inhabited by angels, it ought to be.